Hello everyone and welcome to the Virtual Risk Management Forum. I'm Kevin Arrowsmith, I'm the host for today and I'm Head of Service Innovation at Turnkey and I'm delighted to present our guest speaker, Dr. Neil Patrick, who is Solution Manager for GRC and Security at SAP. We've actually worked together for many years, so I'm very excited for what we have in this session. So, what are we covering today? Well, we're actually going to be looking at the coronavirus pandemic and trying to understand whether it's a black swan event or as a result of poor risk management. Now, in the session, we're going to be exploring some of the consequences of the coronavirus pandemic. You may think that there are all of the different consequences that you've heard out in the industry, in the news. You probably know them all, but actually this session will uncover quite a few that maybe you've not seen before. But also trying to cover whether this should have been anticipated or at least could have been managed better. So it's a bit of an open discussion at that point. Now, what I will say is before I hand over to Neil, is if you have any comments whatsoever, please put them in the comment window and we'll get back to you on that. We have had some questions sent in prior to this and we'll try and cover those questions as well. So, the black swan question that I put out a few weeks ago to social media, it's actually on LinkedIn. I actually posed a question with a poll. In this case of coronavirus pandemic, would you class this as a black swan event? Now, as you can see, 2/3 of people actually indicated that yes, they would be classing coronavirus pandemic as a black swan event, and that 1/3 actually classed this as no, this probably could have been prepared for. Now, I'm very excited to hand over now to Dr. Neil Patrick, who's going to be taking you through whether this is black swan or it isn't. But also anyone who's thinking, what is a black swan event? Neil's going to help answer that as well. Neil?
Thanks, Kev. And yes, it's great to be part of the session, and thank you, Turnkey, for inviting me to participate. Okay, so black swan events. I think it's useful just to look at some definitions. So in the agenda, you'll see we will look at what is a black swan, how is it defined. We'll look at COVID-19 as a pandemic and some history behind that and others. And then I thought for this discussion, I wanted to ask the question, well, why does it matter? Who cares whether it's a black swan or not? And what difference does it make to our lives, in fact, for chief risk officers? And that leads on to discussions around what's the current mindset and what I've seen in some of the media and some of the sessions that I've attended myself as well, and in fact, part of my own thinking. I'd then like to present an approach as what I've called enterprise risk management for good, and how we might help organizations deal with this. And then there's a Q&A session at the end. And as Cav mentioned, because of the nature of the event, those will be questions you can add in later on. Okay, so black swan, some definitions. So the origin of the term for black swan actually has been around since Roman times. And in the Western world, they had never seen a black swan before. So there was a saying that all swans are white. In other words, something was patently obvious. And then they discovered after an expedition to Australia around about the 1700s that black swans did exist. And in fact, a Dutch explorer expedition, they found some black swans and brought them back. So that disproved this theory that all swans are white. And that's kind of where this thing comes from. So the definitions, which has been popularized by this book by Nassim Nicholas Taleb called Black Swan. And his definition for a black swan then is the event is extremely rare. And it's a surprise to the observer, i.e. in their perspective, it's unpredictable. The event has major effects, so consequences on life and people's lives, and there's a severe impact on other areas. And that could be to themselves and other parts within their the ecosystem. And what's interesting in the definition of the third point, that after the first recorded instance of the event, the so-called black swan, it's rationalized by hindsight as if it could have been expected. So the data was available, but was unaccounted for in risk management. So that's something that's called hindsight bias, and that's quite an issue for human beings, in fact. As I want to pick up on this point that it depends on the observer. So one of the analogies is Christmas turkey. So the Christmas turkey during its lifetime has been fed, it's been well looked after, it's got a lovely home, all its wants are met, and then all of a sudden it dies. So for the turkey, that is a black swan event. That's unexpected and the consequences are severe. But for the butcher, it's not at all, because he knew exactly what was in store for the turkey from beginning to end. And we'll return to that theme a little bit later in the presentation. Previous black swan events that Taleb talks about, so it's the rise of the internet, personal computer, World War I, and so on and so on. And talking about how to avoid black swans. So according to Taleb, he says you can't predict the unpredictable. So it's impossible to predict what will happen when a black swan events. Rather, you should set yourself up, or your business is up, in some sort of preparation for the impact of a black swan event, if it's a negative event. But as importantly, and this comes out in the book as well, you need to be able to exploit positive black swans. And if you've been in the risk management domain for a while, excuse me, you'll know that most human beings, or most people, when you talk about risk, they immediately think of the negative consequences of risk. Whereas in actual fact, risk is just uncertainty. And there are positive and negative sides to it. So black swan could actually be positive. And this is one of the things companies need to deal with. Okay, so that's our overview of black swan. We're now going to go into COVID-19. And I've got this slide up here from University of South Wales. I'm not sure that you can see that. Not because they're particularly good or bad. It just was a really nice sign. And I think it indicates what has become our life for the last 3 months or so, with the 2-meter distance, masks, keeping away, give way to others, and so on. It really has disrupted our lives quite a lot. So again, definition of terms. So a pandemic, which is what we have with COVID-19. So it's an infectious disease that spreads across multiple regions. So it's across continents and is worldwide. And I think this defines, that's the difference between a pandemic and an epidemic. So on the right there, which might not be cut off by our images, you'll see that there's a West Africa Ebola epidemic, which you can see that the spike, which is typical of epidemics and pandemics, but it was more local. So a pandemic has multiple continents or worldwide effect. And there have been some through history. So you'll see the note at the bottom. So there's things like smallpox, TB, and the Black Death, which killed, 75 to 200 million people in around about the 14th century. So there has been this history of severe pandemics in the far distant past. But if we look at current data, and this is where we get to the nub of whether this is a black swan or not. So I pulled this off from a few different sources of a selection of recent pandemics. And I looked at more or less the last 120 years or so. And you'll see there's, actually I haven't counted them up, there's 8 or 10 or so. So there's the Russian flu, around about the turn of the previous century, around about 1 million deaths. And I have to say, when I was putting the slide together, I felt uncomfortable about just quoting the number of deaths, because that's actually quite a harsh thing to look at. But I wanted to have a summary for the slide, and that seemed the shortest number to indicate the impact. You can see Spanish flu, Asian flu, Hong Kong flu, AIDS, SARS, swine flu, MERS, COVID. And they've all had a large number of deaths. And from that, you could multiply that by a factor of, 3, 4, 10 for the number of individuals who are impacted, so incapacitated to some extent by these pandemics. And you'll see that the 3 are highlighted. So there are 3 coronavirus pandemics that have been in our existence. The first one is SARS, which is 2002, 2004, then MERS, 2012, 2015, and COVID for present. So I guess you can see where I'm heading with this in terms, have we seen pandemics before and has the impact been global? So the answer to both of those in my eyes is yes. And what's significant about this, so if you look at the deaths, that is terrible, of course, for the individuals and their families concerned. But the consequences of those, you get these linked impacts. And if you're an organization, so we're going to shift the conversation now to a corporate perspective. So it affects your employees. So it affects your ability to run your business. It affects your third parties in your supply chain. So we're heading to a broader ecosystem. It tends to affect infrastructure within the country, excuse me, that you live in, and what we've seen recently with COVID globally. So if you look at transportation and so on. As a consequence of that, it affects governments, and that affects the global economy. So it's the interlinking of the pandemic, which is almost more significant, if you can say that, than the pandemic itself. And this is really what corporations have to deal with. So we get to this question then, so why does it matter whether it's a black swan or not? And the question I've kind of posing is, so is this just an academic or a finger pointing exercise, or goodness knows, a sales opportunity discussion for companies like ourselves? So why does this matter? 2016, excuse me, 2016, the National Academy of Medicines produced a report saying that pandemic diseases will occur. It'll cost over $6 trillion in the 21st century, and globally we should invest $4.5 billion annually to prevent and provide some response to pandemics. So there's 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago, somebody was talking about this already. Taleb talks about, it's quoted in Investopia, a magazine, that the standard tools for probability around predicting a black swan, such as normal distributions, don't apply to black swans because they rely on a large population of data, and by definition in a black swan, you don't have that. So it's quite difficult to know how to handle these black swans. Okay, another point about why does this matter? And this is quite a cheeky slide, and this is from Taleb and a colleague, Spitznagel, in an article, and you can look at the article themselves. And you'll see across it, you need to have a look at this diagram actually to understand what it is. So the little green yellow rectangles along the top are the profit and loss for an organization through time. So generally it's a profitable organization, they're doing quite well. And then right at the end, the yellow rectangle that dips negative is over a short period of time, this very large negative event, this black swan. And because it can be labeled as a black swan, then that organization or the people running the organization can raise their hands up and say, sorry, folks, we didn't know this could happen. We're not accountable. It's not our fault. And this leads to a culture of sustaining businesses maybe that don't know how to look after themselves. And Taleb, in fact, goes further in this and other articles that if this causes a bailout by governments, that just reinforces that tendency for organizations to think that because it's a black swan, they don't have to put anything in place to look after it. And in fact, in that article, Taleb and Spitznagel say that a global pandemic is explicitly presented as a white swan, which is something that would eventually take place with great certainty. And you'll see from the table I put up previously that there is evidence of pandemics happening. What maybe caught some of us by surprise is the global impact of the pandemic, that all organizations have, all countries have in some way responded to it. But I don't think that should be that much of a surprise either, because if you look at the financial crisis, 2010, 2008, we learned there just how much interconnectedness there is between systems, between corporations, between data. And if you take that information plus the likelihood of a pandemic, it's not difficult to guess what would happen. And looking at the impact on countries who've been through epidemics and other pandemics, you would see that there would be a huge shutdown of infrastructure and on individuals' ability to work, in fact. So you see on the bottom right-hand side, and this comes back to the turkey in a way. So one of the little catchphrases is, and this is probably true of all risk management, but black swan specifically. So don't mistake the absence of evidence of harm for evidence of absence of harm. So if you're the turkey, you don't know that your death is coming towards you. So because you haven't seen that information, you don't know it's going to happen. And part of what Taleb talks about and what's good risk management anyway, and banks are doing this now with their scenario planning and so on, is to do little tests and see what is your vulnerability and have scenarios and check what is the impact on your business if certain things happen. So play around with your vulnerability to things. So you can start to gain some of this impact, this evidence of harm. Okay, so moving on to mindset. So where are we? What is our thinking? There's been a lot of conversations, what I've seen so far, they're shifting towards terms like operational or business resilience, and often look at business continuity management and why isn't that more integrated with operational enterprise risk management, let's say. And I just put this slide up, and it's from the Organizational Resilience Framework, the International Consortium for Organizational Resilience. And you'll see there's some of the aspects that they're talking about for business resilience. So we've got business continuity, crisis management, critical environments, and so on and so on, which are absolutely right. I think that's really interesting, and this is where I think organizations should think. I'm a little bit apprehensive that business resilience or operational resilience is going to be the fashion topic of 2021 that we see in RFIs and RFPs. I'm a little bit skeptical or cynic maybe of some of these things and how they pop up. So while it's not a bad thing in itself to look at operational resilience, what worries me is the danger that, and you see this in any corporate environment, is if you see a problem, you set a project up to fix the problem, you fix the problem, then you think you've resolved it. But what I worry about is that we will skip over one of the core foundations of enabling organizations to handle resilience, and that is operational risk or enterprise risk management, that it gets overlooked because it's been around for a while. It's not sexy, it's not new, whereas this operational resilience and so on is. But if it is overlooked, I think what's going to happen is you don't have the information to feed an operational or business resilience plan. That comes from, in my perspective, good enterprise risk management that links operations within the business to consequences to the business and the cost of mitigating those and what structures you have in place to mitigate those. And if you don't have that as a data framework, you can't then extrapolate that and say, now how do I create business or operational resilience? So I'm worried that if you don't have that, if organizations don't have that, you're going to have a garbage in, garbage out. So any investment in resilience is actually not going to be useful and will not protect you from future black swans, or in fact, future pandemics, white swans. Good operational risk and enterprise risk management allows you to link data and consequences between operational activities and strategic activities. And that's important, and we'll touch on that in a little way. And again, what I said just now, what worries me is there's been a big discussion around vulnerability and dependency on supply chains due to COVID, because supply chains is obviously one of the biggest areas that have been affected. So there could be a tendency to say, well, if I fix my supply chain problem, I have fixed my vulnerability to COVID pandemics and maybe other similar black swan events. But again, I think that's dangerous, and we'll go into now a slightly more philosophical academic discussion. Oh, sorry, one more slide to go. We also see, and this is part of the discussion as well, that probably regulating authorities throughout the world will look at putting something in place, governance structures or maybe even regulations, that companies who fit within critical infrastructure supervision provision have to comply with a new business resilience regulation to respond to pandemics. And just dipping into national infrastructure, what we've seen recently is, and you don't need to read all of this, but that's kind of a definition from Wikipedia for the UK, what they define as their critical national infrastructure. But there have been some new dependencies. So previously, financial services has been part of the national infrastructure. And our assumptions generally in the past, maybe not so much after the financial crash, is that if there is an issue, it's a relationship between government and finance. But the dependencies that we've seen in COVID is a relationship between government, financial systems, and individuals. Because as individuals, we can't operate unless our financial systems are working. So we can't buy food online. We can't pay suppliers via contactless. And governments need to make sure that these things are working. So I think that's an interesting shift. What used to be sort of a hands-off relationship with, oh, the banks need to sort themselves out, is now actually quite personal to us. And that triangle now exists within government, critical national infrastructure, and individuals. And in fact, in the UK, the Bank of England, the Prudential Regulating Authority, and the FCA, they've issued a guidance paper around operational risk for resilience, for financial services. So we're heading down this, and I've highlighted just a few at the bottom because I think these lead quite nicely into enterprise risk and one of the topics I want to bring up. So one of the things that organizations, this is for financial services, need to do is they need to set up measures to make sure that the systems that are required to deliver products and services can operate and remain within their impact tolerance. So they need to understand what they are, document them, measure them, and then test using scenarios that should the level of risk change, that they can continue to supply those services and goods. And I think that's quite an interesting part of where we're going to head to now. So a concept. So Black Swan is Taleb's concept, so we're going to refer back to him. He's written several books around risk as a high-level term, and he's got another book where he talks about anti-fragility. And I came across this term some time back for another presentation in GRC, and I quite like this thinking. And I think it fits very neatly into a risk management paradigm. So he has this concept for anti-fragility. He looks at systems, which also equates to organizations, which can be either fragile, robust, or anti-fragile. So what that means is fragile is organizations that are damaged by disorder or volatility or chaos, whatever you might call it. Robust are organizations that are unaffected by disorder. And then anti-fragile are ones that benefit from disorder. And we'll look at a little bit, drilling into that a bit more detail in some examples. So a very crude summary from the book. So fragility, these are organizations or systems which are heavily optimized and possibly automated. And that's fine if everything carries on as expected. They will continue to operate. But of course, things change. And this is where they become fragile because they've been locked into that way of working. There are robust organizations where, because they are so tough and so robust in the way that they work, they don't mind if circumstances change because they know that they can come back, or if they're into a volatile environment, they'll come back to their mode of operation. But there's no learning from that. So again, if things change, it makes it a little bit more difficult. So although the organization exists, so robust is better than fragile. If things change, fragile organizations go out of business. Robust businesses continue to exist, but they don't learn from the change. And then you get the anti-fragile, which grow and strengthen from volatility and stress and chaos. All of this is up to a point, of course. And they do that by having some redundancies, and they have some inbuilt strengthening. And that makes them open to positive black swans. An analogy is if you look at the human body. So if you start running, or if you start doing exercises, your bone density will actually increase to enable you to take the shocks that you're putting through your body. So it has a self-corrective mechanism within the body and a number of redundancies to enable you to do that. And that's really what we're saying. That's the analogy for a way to approach black swans. And there's a whole bunch of definitions at the bottom. I don't need to read those in detail. You get a copy of the slides. But anything that evolves. So our culture, us as a species, your favorite recipes, these things evolve as circumstances change, and they survive. And this is really the key. So that takes us into enterprise risk management for good. And I was playing with words there. So there's two meanings in the context of this presentation of what I meant here. So for good is forever. But for good also means for the good of the business, the community. So let's look at the characteristics of a future-thinking organization, i.e. an anti-fragile organization or business, as the methodology, as the paradigm. So companies are anti-fragile to volatility or chaos if they can quantify where the gains exceed the possible losses and vice versa, in line with their corporate objectives. And that, for me, is a fairly good definition of enterprise risk management or risk management, which is the impact of uncertainty on risk from ISO 30100. So you need to have some understanding of ERM, ORM, some idea of what your risk limits are, and a good integration of information and how you utilize that. Information is quite key to a lot of this, and there's obviously a distinction between data and information. We'll have a look at that just now. So that's the characteristics that you're looking at. Organizations also need to recognize there's an ecosystem beyond the walls of your organization. So we've seen this heavily with COVID. So we look at the supply chain here, but also individuals within your organization and just outside of your organization, and possibly also the culture that you exist within. So that's quite important. We also know that things like IoT and the interconnectedness of everything are here to stay. Now, we always talk about that, but everything is increasing. And if you look at financial services, for example, they are now moving to a world where there are going to be hundreds or thousands of small APIs that do finite tasks and are part of their end-to-end operation and supply chain. So they're not necessarily going to have single monolithic systems. They're going to have lots and lots of systems, lots and lots of suppliers, which are interconnected. And they will have some exposure. And if you look at the Internet of Things, and everyone talks about this, but especially now because a lot of people are now working from home or have been working from home. If devices in your home are connected to your router and your work machines are connected to your router, a vulnerability on your fridge, for example, that will tell you when you're out of, I don't know, flour or bread or whatever it might be, could now cause a backdoor into your corporate network. Okay, so this is increasingly more difficult to, or increasingly more evident now as we've gone into COVID, and there has been a large number of phishing emails, not the number of emails that have increased, but, or attacks that have increased, but the nature has shifted specifically towards phishing to get data from people working at home who maybe don't know or haven't been trained or a little bit comfortable because they've been protected by corporate networks, but then now working at home and they don't have that. There's also a 24/7 news cycle. And what that means is there is no such thing as an isolated incident anymore. So if anything happens to some small part of your organization, it's going to hit the news and you could suffer pretty quickly. There's also an interference or an interrelationship between operational risk and strategic risk, and obviously business continuity. And without operational resilience, in other words, for the business's ability to survive during something like a pandemic, the number of strategic options for decision making at the board become limited. So the avenues for how to continue to run the business and provide their core businesses, their services and goods becomes limited. Just so coming back to the strategic and operational risk, apparently at the beginning of this year, so that's like 1st of January, before WHO called COVID a pandemic, and before, in fact, most of us were aware of this, the share price of a number of organizations in the Fortune 500, and there's about 200 companies in Fortune 500 who have a specific dependency of manufacturing coming out of Wuhan. So not just China in general, but Wuhan specifically. 1st of January, their share price dropped because there were rumors of something nasty coming out of Wuhan, which could affect the supply chain, which could affect their ability to operate. So their strategic thinking was already impacted by something that had not yet become an operational issue. Later, it became an operational issue. And by that stage, their share price had already been affected. So their ability to manage that through operational means was restricted, and their ability to manage that in strategic planning was limited. So there's an increasing relationship now. And here again, we bring in this topic of operational risk linking into enterprise risk, leading into resilience and business continuity. So this interrelatedness of data and how organizations operate. So some sort of just stark reminders or basic reminders. Enterprise and operational risk, just conflating those terms. Op risk cannot be avoided. Operational risk, they can't be avoided. It's people, process, technologies. All organizations can do is mitigate those. So what we're saying, what I'm saying is that this needs to become a real time, so the data is up to date, value add activity so that the board can have good decision making, not an historical backward looking value protect task, i.e. compliance. And in risk, we come into this debate fairly frequently where we want to raise the level and the value that processes and tools bring to an organization from a value protect, i.e. compliance, tick box, that's a cost center, to value add. So decision making based on some of the things we've spoken about before. What are the key services and goods? What are the processes? What's my vulnerability? What do I need in terms of operational resilience to continue to deliver those? And what's my appetite, my limits below which if I go below that, I suffer delivering those. So we need to document those. So how do we do that? So I've got three steps. So I think corporate leadership, they need to set the tone at the top. They need to be able to have the business adapt to new circumstances. And I think one of the key things that will help them is having the risk function fully represented at a board level and being fed with useful performance indicators linked to objectives, because that's what's helping decision-making, good decision-making. You also need to have agile operations. So the business needs to be able to adapt if circumstances change, but as you adapt, as you move through these changes, you need to be sure that the business is safe. So you need to have some sort of assurance feedback loop. And for me, because I work for SAP and we partner with Turnkey, they can deliver services. That ability, that assurance feedback loop, is delivered through integrated. And by organic, I've got in quotes because I mean something that is flexible, something that can understand or be changed if there is a vulnerability or a chaos technology. So that gives us feedback into the decision making. And then the third point is that data and information needs to be treated as a complex asset. And I think that's just necessary to shift the way we think about data and information. So data is a piece of a data element, which could be a phone number or an email address. And then if it's put within a context of how it's used and where it helps the business, then it becomes information. Okay. But organizations need to recognize that it's the information and the data that is going to join the agile operations with assurance to the corporate leadership and the tone at the top, and having KPIs to drive how you make decision making. So companies need to protect, develop, and explore their data and information, and try little risky experiments. And this is where the anti-fragile part comes in. And this is how maybe organizations can try and understand their vulnerability to future pandemics. So if we look at COVID, I would say you don't look at how do I stop a pandemic ruining my business. It would be what happens if my staff now have to work from home again, or something like that. So it's something that is generic, but the outcomes are based on some sort of a business process. So how does it affect my financial processes, or my compliance processes, or my delivery, whatever that might be. So within SAP, then how do we help? Of course, we're at a conference talking about SAP software. So in the GRC and security solutions, we tend to have these 4 themes that we talk about. So enterprise risk and compliance, identity and access governance, cybersecurity, data privacy and protection, and international trade. And for the purposes of this discussion, I'm kind of condensing them right down into just some little bullets, some little nugget thoughts. So enterprise risk and compliance, let's call that the command center. Identity and access governance, let's bucket that under handling digital identity. Cybersecurity, data privacy and protection, let's look at that as something for threat protection. And if we look at then international trade management, let's consider as part of supply chain. I'm going to walk you through some examples of how that might feed into decision making in the business. So if we look at enterprise risk and compliance, so this is quite a busy slide. Let's go from the bottom right hand side. You'll see there's a gray arrow pointing up. Solutions that we have in SAP, so process control and risk management. Together, they might be analyzing, for example, the risk related to available cash. Is there a dependency on a unique supplier for production? Is there an issue lag around maybe my delivery versus the tolerance? Within those systems, we can we can test for evidence of controls, look at particular processes by exception, so you optimize the amount of work. And how do we handle any issues that are open by process or by regulation, by line of business? So that's the engine, which could be, say, like a first line of defense and helped by a third line of defense, a second line of defense, bringing that data together. But what's critical then is that feeds up into a corporate strategy. So in this case, a program of work, the board objective might be increase or maintain profit, which has been one of the, or sales, if you like, which has been one of the key issues at the moment during COVID. So that software with that activity in the business will then feed into programs or performance KPIs around reduced production costs, secure the supply chain planning, and reduce days to deliver. So that allows the organization to understand how they can increase or maintain profits. And you can see then it draws a line between that corporate objective and operations in the business. And that links then operations to strategy. So this is one of the areas that we can do with that part, with that theme. If you look at one of the other themes, so this is now identity and access governance, or digital identity. Bottom right-hand side, if we look at things like cloud identity access governance and some of the other tools that we have looking at the identity lifecycle, you can monitor, say, segregation of duties violations, and you could rank that by the amount of exposure. And especially now, where you've got people working from home, some of the financial processes which used to be conducted in an office and had some paper involved, now have been broken up. So SODs are a lot more complex and more likely, and also with the security changes. So if you can monitor that, that can then help you feed into understanding what is your, maybe your supply chain, because you need to give your third parties access to data, but you need to manage what their access to it is. And you'd maybe have, if you're switching suppliers or if people are moving around, you need to make sure that you reduce the days for them to be able to get access to the data and your ability to deliver, which feeds into that, again, that program and that performance around increasing or maintaining profit. If we look at one of the other themes, the third theme, so look at cybersecurity, data privacy and protection, maybe look at a tool like enterprise threat detection. Now, there we're looking at reducing production costs, so making sure that systems can continue to run safely. We want to understand the security of our supply chain, so maybe from an information security or cybersecurity perspective, or even a data privacy, so that we're not being illegal in terms of exposing data where people have moved around the world, who knows. So you might want to look at the top 10 alerts ETD could manage, rank that by the severity and exposure based on the importance of the various systems that are analyzing. So what are the high value assets that don't maybe have the right security levels, the right patch requirements, or if any systems have been disrupted, or if you had a phishing attack or a breach, which are the systems, what are the processes that are impacted, so that feeds into that program, and of course that feeds into increasing or maintaining the profit for the organization. So linking in strategy with operations. And then if you look at the last one, which is international trade, so if you look at global trade services, what you want to know is as various organizations become difficult to deal with, maybe because your supplier doesn't exist anymore, you need to find others. So what are the trade and customs implications or the legal changes as trade sanctions maybe shift? How much tax are you paying? Where is the best time now to get my goods from? And how's that impacting my, my supply chain? So that feeds into the board objective, again, of increasing, maintaining profit in the supply chain. Cutting that in a different way, now horizontally, because especially in organizations like now, cash is king, okay? So if you look at the operating cycle, and this is it's average time that a business takes to basically make money or to pay for goods when you pay for cash, sell the goods, receive income from those goods, and then use that in the business. And typically it has accounts payable, invoice processing, travel expenses, salary, and cash management. Now, SAP has a number of financial solutions which help each of those particular operations in the operating cycle. And we're very good at doing those. And if you look at S/4HANA, we've got a universal journal, so it reduces the amount of effort, the amount of data, and consolidates the processes. So it's very effective at doing that. But what we can do in the GRC and security aspect is we can put some assurance around that. So we're cutting horizontally through all of those processes. So we can make sure that becomes a reliable end-to-end process. It's not going to get derailed. And at each of the steps as we go through that process, you're going to be protected. So for each of these, we can see where we add value. So if you look at segregation of duties, for example, if you look at fraud and collusion, policy violation, phishing, overpayment risks, maybe issues around credit management. So our software can help ensure that organizations understand how they will be able to maintain and sustain that operating cycle, but also because the software has got this watchful eye looking over it, they can maintain some agility. So if parts of these components shift, maybe physically because people move or because they're using a different supplier, the overall process, so the consequence, the outcome of this end-to-end process is being monitored by our software as like a watchman, and you can get the alerts and the warnings to see where that happens. And then, so how do you bring this all together? So, and this, by the way, you'll be pleased to hear is the last slide. So this is actually, so this is what used to be called digital boardroom. We still sometimes call it that, but it's the information that is fed up from different risk domains into SAP Analytics Cloud. And I think this is also key. So all of the technology that I've spoken about before, they might bring data from different risk domains, financial, reputational, legal, data privacy, and so on, which often operate as silos in the organization. Now, with our software, if you look at S/4HANA, that helps break down those silos, because our GRC and security platform can integrate and talk to each other and talk to S4. We help break down those silos. But then organizations will still have silos that exist or non-SAP products, and that's fine. But you can bring all of that together in something like this in SAC, in the digital boardroom, where you have those different domains come together into a single console for decision making. It's in depth. In other words, it goes to the corners of the business because the software can penetrate. They can analyze that. We can do automated testing. We can do real-time analysis and look for alerts and so on. It's real-time, and by this we mean the risk management definition of real-time, not the trader definition of real-time. So within a minute or within an hour or something like that, they need to know what's actually happening in the business. This console, and that then becomes this tool for the board, for decision makers to understand what are the consequences of the decisions that I make, and they can start using this for scenario planning and looking at the strategic impact and the relatedness between strategy and operations, because this could be seen as an operations dashboard, but because it's got the finance and linking it into financial processes and linking it into corporate objectives, they now have the ability to join all of these together. And there we go. That's the end. We're now on to questions. Over to you, Kev.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was really useful, Neil. Quite insightful as well. So the couple of questions that we had posed to us prior to the event, it's a fairly long one here. You mentioned a black swan event is unpredictable. We may face another event like this in future years. So what would you do to prepare for the next unpredictable event?
So that is quite challenging, I would say, and I think that's a big challenge for all businesses. Couple of points. So the one is, don't think you can predict it's going to happen, because you can't. By definition, you can't predict it's going to happen. Possibly one of the routes people jump to is towards what technology can I buy to help me understand the data, or build in some modeling or something, and they might look at things like machine learning or AI and so on. And while those tools are useful for taking one aspect of a manual task and automating that, I would be nervous of anyone saying, well, if I analyze everything, I can understand what's going to happen, because the technology isn't there to do that. It's a human activity to look at the information and make decisions based on what they see. So while you can automate some things, you can never take out the human factor, I don't think, if you want to have some way of mitigating or putting something in place for black swans. Have this anti-fragility built into the business. So have redundancies built in. Trial little areas of riskiness and see what the impact is on the business, because that's some way that you can learn and build in some capabilities to defend against that. And look for the outcomes that will affect your business. So if you're providing goods and services, what are the core processes that enable you to do those business and services, and which are the absolute key business and services that you need to run the business? And when those start to reduce, what's the impact on the business? So are you shedding staff, or do your profits go down for a while? And do some scenario planning around those. So we've seen people working from home. So if that happens again, what will happen to your business? Or do a scenario where 20% of your supply chain has to change within a day. That will also help you understand where the critical factors for your supply chain. So some of those kind of stress tests, I think. And then join it together. So don't break down the silos. The human body is a fantastic organism, and we are just lucky that our body somehow works together with all the different organs and stuff that we have buzzing around there. So we need to be more like that. We need to be more organic, I think, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. And actually, just expanding on the point of the scenario planning. So, of course, what we've typically seen is where organizations will do some of those scenario plans, they'll get to actually understand what controls they've got in place already, and whether they might genuinely still be appropriate for a particular scenario. And if not, being able to, in advance, prepare to change the design of controls, maybe to cope, or almost have them as a bit of a coping mechanism if a particular event did impact them again.
No, that's true, Kevin. And that reminds me. So if you look at, say, business continuity planning or crisis management or crisis response plans, you can't make those too specific or too detailed either, because if they rely on maybe an individual or an office or a function that when they're called into place 2-3 years down the road, if that function doesn't exist, that plan will fail. So there needs to be some flexibility around that. So testing those, as you're saying, I think is a good learning exercise.
Yeah. And then the final question we had, not all of our risk data is in one system. How would we manage reporting like what was showed?
Yeah. So the glib answer is have some sort of umbrella reporting. And okay, so we would say use SAP Analytics Cloud because it takes data naturally from SAP, but it takes data from non-SAP systems. And as long as you put some meta tags around that and format that correctly, you can bring that into the decision making that you use through SSE, and other systems are involved. But this is not only solved by technology. So the technology, let's say if it's SAP and you can use SAC, that brings that content in through the digital boardroom. You have to engage the human beings who are the board, who are the leadership team, in more meaningful discussions around how enterprise risk management linked into operational resilience will help decision making based on the appetite in line with their corporate objectives. So it's not just when the CRO stands up and gets his 15-minute slot to go through the list of risks for the board and it's tick, 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 is there anything dangerous? Okay, fine, go. It's not that. It is a proper, almost ongoing scenario planning exercise for the good of the business. And that's why I'm saying it's enterprise risk management for good, for their good, in line with these objectives. And I think that the culture needs to change as to how this information is used. And I'm hoping that one of the good things that might come out of COVID is a recognition of the importance of proper, good risk management throughout the organization.
The other variable that I see, maybe a slightly technical angle to it, is different areas of the business are at different stages in their risk management processes. So
Right.
Some might have particularly mature processes, maybe underpinned by some of the best, I guess, the best of breed solutions to support them, whereas other areas of the business are still managing things on Excel spreadsheets and still having a bit of a data challenge problem. So I think, so trying to answer that fact, you need to understand what information you are collecting across the business, regardless of how mature that data quality is. You just need to understand how that is being captured, because then when you tackle that from a culture perspective, you know the size of the challenge that you're dealing with. I mean, some people will get it naturally and it's sorted, whereas others may need a little bit more coaxing or convincing as to there is a better approach to getting that data surfaced up to the enterprise better. Yeah,
and you're right. And this, these are non-trivial things. I mean, I think the business change required to put something of what we're talking about in place is significant. But I think that's going to define the businesses that are resilient or anti-fragile going forward, so they can cope with future pandemics against the ones that don't. And it'll just take another significant event like this, which will unfortunately weed those out. That does actually, sorry, that I know I need to be careful with time. That reminds me of one other point though. So if you look at, so data quality is a huge amount of analysis of financial systems. So financial risk is fairly well analyzed. And there's a lot of high tech that's been thrown in IT that's been thrown at analyzing financial systems. But this always amazes me. The thing is with financial systems or financial analysis, generally speaking, the business has the decision. They can continue with that financial avenue or not. Or that instrument, or that thing that they're sharing or selling. All of the failures of businesses in the last 20 or 30 years have failed because of inability to handle operational risk, because you can't ignore it. All you can do is mitigate it. So the quality of data from financial data is usually pretty good. You can make decisions about that. The quality of data from op risk is maybe not so good. But you don't have to analyze it to the level of 99.999% security. You could just do it at a very high level, very aggregate level. So if you look at health and safety, which is, by the way, what COVID is, it's a health and safety incident, which has become a strategic nightmare. So you could take a high level risk summary from a system that maybe is based on Excel, but the highest, the ultimate risk for the top level 2-3 risks coming out of that system could then enter into your op risk or your enterprise risk engine. And you can make decisions based on that. At least you get some idea of what's happening in the business, and that there might be something you need to worry about.
Yeah. Honestly, Neil, we could probably discuss and debate.
It's one of those.
Yeah, exactly. About risk management. It's something that obviously both of us are very passionate in. But yes, unfortunately, we do have to look at time, probably make way for the other speakers in the conference. So probably going to be looking to start to wrap this up now.
Okay.
If you do, anyone that does have any further questions, please do post them into the comments. We'll get round to them and we'll make sure that they are answered as well. So don't worry, they're not lost in a vacuum, and we'll definitely get round to answering those. But if you're thinking about what is next and who is coming next, there are many other sessions available. So if you go to forum.turnkeyconsulting.com, you'll see the various tabs across the top, as you can see on the screenshot. If you go to the agenda, you'll see what is coming up. So both the live sessions, but we've also got an on-demand library as well. Lots of different content from quite a lot of different domain experts, consultants. So again, a lot of information for you to consume. So with over 25 odd sessions, and we seem to be still adding some as we go as well. So with that, Dr. Neil Patrick, been fantastic as always. Really appreciate the session. It's been fantastic.
Pleasure.
So thank you everyone for listening. I've been Kevin Arrowsmith, Head of Innovation at Turnkey, and Dr. Neil Patrick, thanks once again.
Thanks everyone.